All right, so today will mark the end of the progressive era in this class. We're going to shift gears a little bit and look at foreign policy inside of the progressive era. And it's interesting because, as much change as happening during the progressive era domestically, with direct election of senators, liberalization of politics in general, conservation of resources, looking at labor, all that sort of stuff. What we see with foreign policy is imperialism, which doesn't seem necessarily to go hand in hand with what progressivism is. So it's kind of interesting. This is an era where we're very aggressive internationally, but also very liberal domestically. And like I said, you don't usually see that. And let's talk about who's leading this. And just, of course, maybe to give you a hint, it's going to be Teddy Roosevelt, the preeminent figure of the progressive era. So ever since we, had first settlement in America during Jamestown, Americans are pushing west, right? They're looking for more territory and looking to open basically a release valve for all of the influx of immigration that's continuing to happen. Now, the release valve is always the American West, but by 1890, the frontier is closed and we can't go anywhere. We're not going to go to Mexico. We're not going to go to Canada. We have Alaska, but it's considered a frozen polar bear icebox, and so that's not going to be seen as a viable option either. So what we end up doing is looking overseas. Industrialists are also looking to expand their businesses west to new markets and internationally to new markets. And we're also looking to get cheaper resources. Many nationalists, both at the United States and abroad, claim that colonies are a sign of a nation's power. And even though the majority of land has been gobbled up by Europeans, the remaining territory, there are a few areas left in the world that can be colonized. But we are very late to the game. The United States is very late to the game. And that's why before World War I, America is pretty much just the 45 U.S. states and then Alaska. But by the end of World War I, and really at the end of the Spanish-American War, we've gained many territories, including the American Samoa Islands, the Pacific, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. We also established what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What this says is basically that the whole Western Hemisphere should be and is an American sphere of influence. This was added to the Monroe Doctrine that said that we would not stand for any European intervention inside of the United States or the Caribbean or the rest of the Western Hemisphere. But this time we actually have the power to enforce this sort of idea. We also get the right to build the Panama Canal and maintain it. All right. And basically during this era, we want to pay attention to the fact that the United States is moving from very purely isolationist to very involved in world affairs. Okay, and this is going to happen pretty quickly, and it starts with the first nudge from Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Alaska. Okay, Alaska is not initially seen as a very valuable commodity or territory. It's purchased in 1867, right after the Civil War, by William Seward, the Secretary of State. But it was seen as a wasteland. It was labeled Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. We bought it from the Russians for $7.2 million, but no attention is paid necessarily to settling it. So, Alaska, like I said before, is not seen as this new release valve, even though it's an enormous amount of territory, about double the size of Texas. So, we have it. It's seen as a wasteland and really it is not going to be settled for quite a while. We also get into conflicts with a variety of European powers during the late 19th century and the 1890s. We get into a conflict with Britain and Germany and the Samoan Islands, also New Orleans, after we lynch 11 Italians. In Chile, 2 Americans are killed in a bar, and also in British Guyana, over disputed forests that had gold. So the United States is active internationally, and we're kind of sparring for a fight, but we're not going to necessarily do it with our with the other strong European powers. Okay, we'll try and look at a weaker power. Okay, before that though, we end up annexing Hawaii. Okay, Hawaii is one of those Pacific islands that is available. Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean right here. Okay, and it was independent. It was led by a hereditary monarch. Okay, and we had been there for a while, running sugar plantations. Those that held those sugar plantations made enormous profits. But what happened in 1890 is Congress passes a tariff known as the Hawley Tariff that raised sugar duties and basically made all of the gains from making sugar non-existent. So the planters in Hawaii, which many are U.S. citizens, decide that they want to be annexed into the United States. But there's a monarch there, Queen Liliuokalani. I'll show you a picture of her. Liliuokalani is not interested in having any sort of annexation take place. And as a result, you're looking very European right here. And as a result, basically, the planters and military take things into their own hands. In 1893, the planters have an uprising to get rid of the queen, and without the approval of the president, U.S. Marines basically attack the island and raise the American flag in Honolulu. Liliuokalani is forced to abdicate, and Hawaii becomes an American territory. Grover Cleveland, who became president rather, right as this is being done, is very much an intense anti-imperialist and wants to investigate how this went down. But despite wanting to restore Liliuokalani to her throne, American sentiment is against him. They want Hawaii to become part of the United States, and basically he's kind of forced to accept this imperialist action, even though he didn't want it to happen. Okay, we're going to put all sorts of naval bases here, and it finally will become a state in 1959. And this is where, of course, we create Pearl Harbor, which will be attacked and then lead the United States into World War II. In Cuba, let's switch gears real quick. In Cuba, all right, at the turn of the 20th century, the major European power that still has a foothold in many areas in the Western Hemisphere is Spain. And Spain is very, very weak at this point. Okay, Spain, holds Puerto Rico, they hold Cuba, and the United States is finally going to start to push the remnants of Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. So what happens is we basically create a situation where we can attack Spain and blame it on them. In 1895, Cuba had been in revolt against Spain. All right, the Spanish sent a general, Valeriano Weyler, to put this rebellion down. 200,000 Cubans are thrown into concentration camps and killed. And basically the U.S. uses this as a justification for attacking and liberating the Cubans. Okay, we also get a letter that is intercepted from the Spanish criticizing President McKinley at the time, and then most importantly, the battleship the Maine, the USS Maine, blows up in Havana Harbor, killing 260 American sailors. Now, yellow journalists at the time and other media outlets basically blame Spain for these sorts of attacks, even though it's almost certain that a boiler blew up in the battleship, the Maine. But we hold them responsible. So, in 1898, McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war and intervention in Cuba, and we get it. The caveat is that when a Teller Amendment is passed, the U.S. could not annex Cuba. Okay, after this, the America is going to be in open war with the Spanish throne. During the actual war, okay, now, remember when we fight, the U.S. had not been fighting anybody since the Civil War, when we had been fighting ourselves, besides Native Americans. So our army is very, very unprepared. They're understaffed, under-equipped, under-trained. We have very, very heavy woolen clothing. We don't have enough money for food, right? And this is a horrible way to go into a fight. Fortunately, Spain is even less prepared. Also, at this point in time, there's no Panama Canal, so we had to have a navy in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay, the Spanish Navy was stationed in Manila Bay in the Philippines, and actually, what happened is before the war, okay, the Secretary of the Navy, which is Teddy Roosevelt at this time, sends Admiral George Dewey to Manila in the Philippines, and to basically be ready to attack their fleet as soon as war is declared. So he's there right when it's declared. He attacks and absolutely crushes the Spanish Navy. The boats were made out of wood. Spanish boats made out of wood. America's boats are made out of steel. All right, and it's amazing. We only lose one casualty in this whole fight, and it was from sunstroke. So I mean, absolute smashing win for the United States, and we basically destroy the Spanish fleet and take the Philippines as a result. Our Navy also lands in Cuba, and the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt's group of volunteers made up of cowboys, college students, and ex-convicts. This is where the famous charge up San Juan Hill takes place, and we take Santiago Bay, destroying the Spanish Atlantic fleet. So within a matter of months, both fleets from of the Spanish fleets are destroyed. The U.S. military loses very, very little. We end up winning the war, getting a huge land grab, getting the Spanish outside of the Western Hemisphere, taking the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico in the process. Cuba, all right, will not become part of the United States. All right, it remains independent. Spain will be paid $20 million for those losses. All right, so I guess they will be compensated somewhat, even though they're losing an enormous amount of territory. And it's interesting is not everyone in America is super pumped about this. Anti-imperialists condemn the war. They think it's an imperial, anti-isolationist stance for the United States, which it is. And they're kind of proved right a little bit because after the war, a new war erupts in the Philippines, and Filipino rebels end up fighting 3 years for their independence against Americans. What's interesting about this is 4,000 Americans will die, which is actually 10 times the amount lost in the Spanish-American War. Now, most of these are from disease, but still, holding a colony is seen as a dumb thing to do, especially after this war, which is why the United States, we never really make an attempt to colonize even the stuff that we win in the Spanish-American War, besides Puerto Rico, I guess you could say. But the Philippines will eventually be given back, as it's just seen as too costly to hold on to in terms of money and lives. 20,000 Filipinos lose their lives, though, in this battle, in this war, rather. We also, during this time, add what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary to Monroe Doctrine. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine, of course, by James Monroe, was issued in 1823 that closed the Western Hemisphere to any European involvement. We couldn't really enforce that, which is why Spain was kind of doing what they wanted to do during that time period anyway, until the Spanish-American War. But by 1900, the United States is strong. Roosevelt is a very bold president, and he basically creates a scenario where we are willing to parade our military through Latin America to make sure that Europe stays disinvolved. We passed the Platt Amendment, which prohibited Cuba from signing any treaty that might infringe on its own independence, so it wouldn't be a colony again. It couldn't carry a large debt, so therefore be under economic control of Europeans. Cuba had to agree to have American troops land at any point if there was any civil unrest or threat of civil war, which is what we do actually at the Bay of Pigs in the 1950s. And Cuba also has to agree to lease a naval base to us at Guantanamo Bay, right? So, we get independence from Cuba, and we basically say, hey, Cuba is independent, but in all but name, Cuba becomes an American protectorate for the first half of the 20th century. Roosevelt Corollary's actual term said that if Latin America engaged in a chronic wrongdoing, which of course is vague on purpose, some of these things, though, would include carrying a large debt or civil unrest, and the U.S. could intervene militarily. So basically, in a nutshell, it said the U.S., whenever it chooses, can send troops into the Caribbean or into Cuba. And it turns America into a police force in the Western Hemisphere, okay? And thus we see, this political cartoon where the United States has our big stick policy from Theodore Roosevelt, and is parading our gunboats through the Caribbean to keep all of those areas in check. The doctrine is challenged in 1905. European debt collectors try and attempt to invade the Dominican Republic. What happens is Americans seize the Dominican Republic's custom houses and basically rules it as a protectorate. So we don't mess around. We're willing to protect our interests in the entire Western Hemisphere. And the truth is, we have to this day. The United States does not remotely allow any sort of open intervention inside the Western Hemisphere. And the United States will inhibit democracy from spreading inside of Latin America as a result of this policy. Roosevelt's motto, I just mentioned, is called speak softly and carry a big stick. In other words, use the threat of military intervention in order to promote diplomatic solutions. All right, our big stick rather is going to be our Navy. Okay, as you can imagine, the corollary was not looked on favorably by many Latin Americans who want self-rule. Okay, and by the end of the 20th century, the U.S. had invaded the Caribbean and Latin America 35 times. So we are very involved in what's going on in this area. Now, we're also very involved in Asia. Japan had been opened to trade by the Commodore Matthew Perry in 1854. Matthew Perry, of course, is not the Friends star, so keep that in mind. American businessmen earned millions through trade with Asia. At the time period, China was carved into the spheres of influence by European powers. The United States was not one of those carvers. The United States wants an open door policy to keep China open to all nations. Only the UK, United Kingdom, agrees to keep a door open, okay? But in a nutshell, China will remain closed to any sort of open free trade agreement. They get sick of being imperialized by a variety of European powers, and a group of revolutionaries known as the Boxers rises up in 1900, and it's actually supported by the Empress at the time. But this rebellion is put down by a multinational national force. Okay. There's also a war that goes on during this time period known as the Russo-Japanese War, and the Russo-Japanese War basically ends in a major victory for Japan. Theodore Roosevelt will step in and help broker the deal. He ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize as a result of this. But the Japanese public doesn't support the treaty. They think that they should get more territory. They actually beat the Chinese a decade earlier before this and got a whole bunch more territory out of that. So, Japanese-American tensions, even though we help mediate this treaty, we don't become major allies as a result of this agreement. Japan knows that we have bases in the Philippines, and they're also wary that Roosevelt is sending, the Great White Fleet, which is this picture right here, around the world to show our naval might. Right, so we're kind of set up in the years just before World War I with a showdown with Japan, even though we're technically allies. As you can see here, U.S. is firmly losing its identity as an isolationist power. We are meddling as much as possible in the affairs of other nations, and showing that we can be on the world stage and maybe even be the #1 power. All right, the last thing we want to talk about is the Panama Canal. This is a huge pet project of Teddy Roosevelt. To travel from New York to San Francisco, you either have to go on an overland route, through train, or you have to go 12,000 miles around the tip of South America, right? So we decided that the time is right to build a canal. First obstacle is the United Kingdom. We had signed a treaty with them in 1850, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which said that neither side would build a canal. Okay. Later, a new treaty signed known as the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which allowed the U.S. to build a canal as long as they charged the same rates to all those traveling through, so they couldn't favor one power over the other, and Britain will give up its claims to building a canal. Now, Britain had built canals before. It helped build the Suez Canal with the French. Okay. Now, the French had also tried to build one through Panama in the 1870s. All right, disease, financial problems made them stop. Panama is very, very mountainous, has a bunch of um, swampy lakes. So it would need blasting, draining, and also the construction of locks, okay, which is basically a system of waterways that raise the water level of ships passing through. You can see them on this map right here, because the Pacific was lower than the Atlantic. So you couldn't just cut a waterway all the way through. It would flood a major portion of Panama, okay? Another nation that was under consideration was Nicaragua. It was flatter, and it had a ton of lakes that could be connected, but of course it would have been longer in distance. Now, Panama at the time is not independent. It's actually under the control of Colombia. So the U.S. had to negotiate with Colombia and actually sponsors an uprising in Panama to overthrow Colombian control. As a result, the U.S. got a 10-mile wide strip of land to build the canal. So Roosevelt made this rebellion happen. We even sent a gunship down to make sure that Colombia stays out of this whole thing. So we get our canal zone, we get our canal, we can start construction in 1907, and it takes a really long time, 7 years to finish. It ends in 1914, costs $345 million. If you're paying attention, that is $37.5 million more than it took to buy the entire state of Alaska, right? So, very, very expensive. Lots of workers die. 5,600 workers total die. Only 350 white Americans, though. So, it was mostly deadly for minorities, and most of these deaths were from disease. But the United States gets it, and we are now operating in a world in 1914, right at the beginning of World War I, where the United States can send materials to anywhere in the world way, way quicker than we could have just years before. All right, that is the story of American imperialism in a nutshell. Please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.